Etmanski has spent the last 10 years exploring the world of social innovation, looking for useful insights about social change that lasts. He's met, read, studied, spoken, and applied, traveled, stumbled, and written. What has emerged and what he's sharing with us today in this work are the 6 recognizable patterns that he's been able to identify around what it takes to spread a social innovation. In this new book, Impact, Al points out that strategies have limitations and that it's really worth paying attention to the deeper patterns of change if you hope to make the world a better place. So welcome, Al. I'm thrilled to have you with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Sylvia, and hello to everybody out there in broadcast land or webinar land. Very exciting for me. Thanks for giving me this opportunity, Tamarack.
So, Al, when we were sort of thinking and talking about this webinar, I think the title, Impact, 6 Patterns to Spread Your Social Innovation, a natural question that kind of bubbles up before we kind of dive into those 6 patterns is, how would you define social innovation?
Well, I actually probably wouldn't define social innovation, and in the book I try to avoid it. So it's really more a sense for me. So let me say first, there are lots of good definitions of social innovation out there. My old home at SIG, Social Innovation Generation, has, I think, a brilliant one. There's lots of other ones from the UK, from the United States. Others in Canada have developed their own. So there's no shortage. In fact, I think there's about 20 million definitions. I'm just a little worried that we get over zealous about definitions or preoccupied by them. So my sense of social innovation is that it's a mixture of the old ways of making change that have worked, and added with some new approaches and with a dash of surprise. So for me, social innovation is more about blending the old, the new, and recognizing that surprise will happen.
What a fabulous definition. I wonder, I mean, it is interesting, as you say, in a field where there are so many definitions. Is your decision not to kind of be too prescriptive about a definition, is that it helps you keep your curiosity open? Is that, like, I'm curious. I just want to, you know, cautions about definitions.
Yeah. Well, so Peter Gabriel, so this may date me, but the great, you know, singer-songwriter Peter Gabriel, it says he writes all of his music is written with an eye to the future, but anchored in the past. And so the reality is, you know, the truth is that you know, people have been making change, have been making the world a better place for an awfully long time, for millennia, and there's a lot in the ways that people have achieved change that we want to pay attention to, that we don't want to jettison or throw out. So it's very, very important to not create a sense with social innovation that it's all about the new. So it is, in that sense, as Peter Gabriel writes, anchored, you know, in the past and particularly in what has worked. But obviously, things change. Things change, you know, constantly. We're learning. We're continuous to learn, and so we do want to factor in new idea, new approaches, new experiences, new expertise, new methodologies that work. And so it is that mixture. But you know, the great Canadian short story writer who won a Nobel Prize, I think, bases all of her short stories, all of her incredible short stories, on the notion of surprise. Surprise will happen, and so that's why I say it's a mixture of the old, the new, and the surprising.
And the author you were speaking of, Alice, is Alice Munro, yeah?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Did I just say her first name? Alice Munro. You bet.
Yeah, I'm an avid fan of Alice Munro, so I kind of got that. So regardless of how we define social innovation, why would you think it's really important for us all to strengthen our understanding and skill of the practice of social innovation, however we choose to define it?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, well, let me use an analogy. We're now in the smartphone era, I think it's fair to say. And if that industry had relied on, dial-up technology, or anybody in that industry that had relied on dial-up technology would be way behind the curve. And so being intentional about change is my particular interest. Being conscious of what works, studying it, being, paying attention to the Canadian successes at making change. We have a rich history, in Canada. For me, is pretty important. There's a lot of popular myths about making change, and in fact, in the book, Sylvia, in what you could look at it as a summary of all the mistakes I've made. I think it's fair to say I've had some successes, but what I've noted about all of those successes, including changing legislation, that they're short term, that the long-term impact that I've sought has often eluded me. And so, at some point in my life, I looked up because a lot of change makers, you're busy you're scrambling for resources, you're really focused on bringing your idea into fruition, and you don't have much time or resources to look up and see what else is going on, let alone, pay attention to what I call those deeper patterns of change. And so what I've learned is the importance of looking up from the day to day and stepping back a bit and reflecting, and that in that regard, I'd like my book to be a meditation for that 1% of the time when people are capable of stepping back and thinking.
That's so beautiful, because it really kind of helps us to see. You're right, I think. Anyone who's really worked hard on the front line of trying to bring forward a positive change, it can become all-consuming. And what you're reminding, what's certainly coming up for me is the need to kind of simultaneously cultivate two different viewpoints, and that's hard, right? You got to think about the short term, how do you keep the thing alive, and at the same time never lose sight of that long term, what's this all about, and what's the intention and impact kind of underpinning what it is I'm trying to do. And wow, if this book can help us kind of toggle back and forth between those perspectives, what a gift. Thank you. So one of the things that really kind of caught my attention, and certainly you wrote about in a recent blog and article, was that as you kind of went on this writing journey, you had a critical kind of moment, an epiphany, and it led you to kind of completely reconfigure how you had sort of imagined the book looking. And part of that epiphany was really the need to, and the decision to reframe, focusing on what you call the terroir that is uniquely Canadian. So, really wanting to drill down and narrow your focus and exploration around patterns of social innovation by looking specifically within the boundaries of Canada. Can you talk to us a bit more about sort of what you now see as Canada's unique social innovation terroir, and what you think that the implications of that are in terms of those of us who are trying to do social innovation work in Canada?
Well, every place, every location, every region, every country has a unique configuration of history, heritage, experience, context. And so I'm not suggesting that Canada's is any better than anywhere else's, but I am suggesting that it's worth paying attention to how we've achieved change that has benefited, our citizens in the past. And I tell the story in the book of Adelaide Hoodless, who most Canadians are not aware of. But in the late 1800s, just outside Hamilton in Stony Creek, Ontario, she created the Women's Institute. Well, to move forward, over 110 years, just a couple of years ago, the Women's Institute was declared as one of the top 10 social innovations in the world. And the Women's Institute is now in over 70 countries. I think it has about 6 million members, and it is credited with ushering in the first wave of feminism. Well, hallelujah, that's something that we can learn from. And so that's one example. Another, Sylvia, that I like to talk about is that when we became a nation in 1867, one of the very first decisions that our legislators made was free public education. That was significant. And this happened, I want to remind people, at a time when Canada was bankrupt. It had a very small population that was thinly stretched across the border. The American Civil War was just over. They were bellicose. They were looking at territorial expansion. We had just come out from under the protective shadow, of Britain, and we lived in a very harsh climate. We live in a very harsh climate, and arguably the legislators could have made a decision to allocate more money for the military, and they made a value-based decision to create free public education. Anyway, those are just two examples. So I'm particularly interested in those aspects of change making that are Canadian-based, that are, as I've said, value-based. Second, that have had some longevity to them, some durability to them. I go on. Greenpeace reinvented environmentalism, Moody Institute in Nova Scotia, and what they did after the and the cooperative economy. I could go on and on. When we start looking, it's everywhere, and we can learn, and we should. And again, it's not that we're better, but it's that this has emerged out of the unique configuration that has become Canada.
One of the things I'm completely struck by is, until you wrote about it, I knew nothing about Adelaide Hoodless. And I've lived my entire life in Canada. So it does sort of, or the story that you just told about public education, like it really does help to remind me anyway, that yeah, you got to know the stories of your own place, because place helps to shape who you are and whose shoulders you're standing upon as you kind of do the work. I see here, Al, we've got a question from Deborah Johnson, and what she, kind of going more deeply into this notion of terroir. She's saying, is there more grassroots initiatives because Canada has such a broad geographic scope, and I'm assuming also like a smaller population? Is that one of the patterns that you saw, kind of in terms of framing concretely how, what's unique about Canada's social innovation?
I think that's a very important question, Deborah, and I don't have a complete answer to it. I've thought a lot about it, and I think it's something that we should think some more about. I think it is partially because our ingenuity and creativity and innovation comes out of harsh circumstances. Of course, we've got the modern conveniences of furnaces and in the summer, air conditioners, but we have survived, and I would argue thrived in an adverse climate. And what it has led me to conclude is that the majority of social innovations that have lasted have come out of a group of people that I call passionate amateurs. And these are people who invent, create, solve a challenge for two reasons. One, because someone or something they love is in danger, is vulnerable, is in pain, is being exploited, however you want to describe it, number one. And number two, if they don't do something about it, nobody else will. So it's this kind of combination of love and necessity. And I don't know if it's unique to Canada, but it is certainly resplendent in Canada. I used Adelaide Hoodless a moment ago as an example. Well, she created the Women's Institute because her infant son Jack died drinking contaminated milk at the age of 2. And she was determined that that would never happen again. So the practical purpose of the Women's Institute was to have mothers teaching mothers about how to prepare food, that was safe. And remember, this is going back to the late 1800s. Out of that emerged a way of engagement and participation by women in society that hadn't really happened before, and that then led to why people say that this led to the first wave of feminism. But in that context, Adelaide Hoodless was and is a passionate amateur. As I go across the country, that's what I see. Alphonse Desjardins created this amazing credit union movement in Quebec because he saw the injustice of the loans that were being given to people who were poor. Or Alphonse Cody. Anyway, I could go on and on. So, Deborah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to riff on this a bit. Don't have the complete answer, but I do think that this is part of what I notice in Canada.
Thanks so much, Al. I'm really kind of taking away that some of the terroir helps to shape values, so decision-making around values. This piece that you've offered us around, passionate amateurs who bring both the love and the necessity are key ingredients that are common to so many of the examples of social innovation that you looked at. I'm wondering if I can ask us to shift now. So when you did this deep exploration of these different social innovations over time, you were able to step back and note that there are 6 patterns, right, that seem to be consistent around how social innovations kind of start as a novel idea, but then over time evolve into something that we all just take as a given. So can we ask you to spend a little time kind of speaking to each one of those 6, and what does that really mean, and maybe kind of a concrete example of each one?
Sure. So Sylvia, before I do, and apologize to the listeners right now because this might go on, a little bit too long. I'll try and keep it, short. But I want to say, 2 things. One, these patterns emerged out of a journey, out of an exploration that my wife and working companion Vicki Kamak and I did for 2 years at the request of the McConnell Family Foundation. They were concerned, as we were, about this paradox of short-term success. Their grantees were being successful. Our work at Plan had achieved some modest success, and yet when we looked, and when McConnell looked, the dial hadn't changed on poverty or homelessness or the isolation of people with disability, or you name the issue or challenge. So it's this, this kind of quest to see how we could improve our ability to make durable change. And the 6 patterns, I confess, you're making them more glorious perhaps than they should be, but they were almost a self-defense mechanism. They were our attempt to make sense of what we were learning, and so there may be more out there, or there maybe there should be less. They're just our observations of what we noted, and we've kind of used that framework since then to try and understand how to make durable change. But I would just want to say that if people think that they're perfect, or that that they're exactly what they should be applying, then maybe there's something wrong with them. Just use them as a framework. Okay for a startup, Sylvia, and then should I just launch into it, or did you want to?
Absolutely. And I think when we were chatting initially, one of the things that we talked about was how is so maybe we can start here. How would a pattern be different than a strategy?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, good. Thanks for reminding me of that. Well, maybe the simplest way is that as I see strategy, you're at A, and you know where you're going. You're going to B, and so you put in place a strategy to help you get there. And where I think we're at, actually, I think it's very, for the kind of challenges that we want to tackle, climate change and species extinction and moving from a carbon-based economy, homelessness, abuse, you name it. These are going to, require some modesty or humility in our thinking. And I would suggest that we're at A, but we're going to maybe. That we're not 100% certain. We know the direction we want to go in, and we know what we want to achieve in general terms. And so where a pattern is helpful is that, if you accept pattern, these are, this is built on observations, connections, relationships between seemingly disparate events that show up so regularly that you can't ignore it. Whereas in a strategy, if something happens, you might treat it as irrelevant, as kind of getting in your way of powering through. But in a pattern, you're going, I wonder what that's telling me. Is there something emerging here that I should pay attention to? Maybe I should go sideways. Maybe I should stop for a moment. Maybe I should figure out a way to connect with that group of people who I didn't think were about the same thing, but maybe they are. Maybe there's something there that can help me, or maybe there's a new methodology. So a pattern opens up our palette, expands it, and prepares us for that inevitable surprise. So I hope that's
it's very helpful because obviously one of the things that I as I look at them, my mind is leaping ahead to, okay, so how do I take this knowledge and integrate it in what I'm doing or how I think about this work, and I think what you've done for me in framing it that way is sort of saying, yeah, these are patterns, and it's a way. It's almost like it's not a what, but it's a how. It's a way in which I might want to think differently about how I approach the work, which is different than a strategy, which is interesting. So talk to us about this first one, thinking and acting like a movement. What does that mean, and sort of how does it play into this whole work of social innovation?
Yeah, well, so this pattern is not about starting a movement, although your actions may be the spark that ignites another one. But I would suggest that we are already part of more than one movement, and so what I'm wanting us to do is to pay more attention to the movements we're part of, to the key players in the movements that we're part of, and to become more deliberate about aligning our efforts. There are two characteristics of movement, Sylvia, that I think enable deep impact change. For one, movements are they're the most inclusive vehicle I know of. Everyone belongs to a movement. There are no membership requirements, and no one is really in charge. And for another, movements shift cultural norms, attitudes, and beliefs. They expand the boundaries of what is socially acceptable. But because no one's in charge, we have almost a deeper responsibility to, while we're involved in our organizational and institutional objectives, to also pay attention to the players in the movements that we're part of, to make sure that as many of the vectors move in the same direction. In the book, I profile a movement that has influenced our work at Plan very, very, very deeply, and that's La Leche League, and I managed to spend some time with Marianne Thompson. This is a group of 7 mothers. They call themselves ordinary housewives in the late 1950s, who launched, really a shift in society's attitudes towards breastfeeding. So that's kind of one example. Adelaide Hoodless, the Women's Institute, is another. Shall we just keep going here, Sylvia?
Yeah, but I'm sort of hearing there's an interesting sort of question that has come through for us around Twitter that's kind of relevant here. The question is, as we see many passionate amateurs across the country, it's important to find ways for like minds to collaborate. And in a way, that's exactly what you're telling us to do, right? It's that there's a movement. It's not necessarily always about creating one, but more about being aware of the movements that you are already part of and how to link them up. Is that correct? Am I kind of getting to the right understanding here?
Yeah, and well, let me just flip. So that's a great question. Let me just flip to pattern 3. So we'll just play around here.
Okay, good.
Which I describe as setting the tables for allies, adversaries, and strangers. So bounce off that observation. Social innovators come from every walk of life. They don't. There's no dress code, and they just don't hang out at the great escalation of social innovation hubs and hives that are happening in Canada. Of course, those are great, but not all social innovators hang out there. In fact, they may be part of governments. They may be part of big institutions and corporations and businesses. And these social innovators shimmer with as much passion and conviction as any of us. And so as I see the social innovation journey, I look at it as comprising 3 types of social innovators. The passionate amateurs that I've talked about, or who I sometimes call disruptive innovators. They are the people who are challenging the status quo, who are reminding us that every groove eventually becomes a rut. And so they're the people who help us get out of the rut. But often the skills, the attitudes, the time requirements to disrupt the status quo doesn't necessarily make them the favorite people of the status quo, of the institutions. And that's where another group of innovators come forward, who I call bridging innovators. And in Canada, our foundations have stepped up in this regard. And you know what they do as well as any group I've ever seen is, first of all, they interpret the benefit, the impact of the disruptive innovation to the status quo. But equally, they coach and mentor the disruptors and remind them of some of the limitations of our institutions. And so I don't know if my computer is I don't know what's happened. Vicky, if you're on the line, bring your computer down. I'll try and use that. So the third group are receptive innovators.
Right.
And these are people who are able to introduce the disruptive innovation into the system. They know the formal and informal channels. They're the navigators. And one example is the Registered Disability Savings Plan. It was a great disruptive innovation, but it would have gone nowhere without a number of foundations who held meetings to help us refine the concept. I'd be embarrassed to share with you what our original idea was. And so these bridging innovators were helpful, but I can tell you that once the decision was made to have a registered disability savings plan in Canada, within 18 months, public servants in our federal government, as well as in all the provinces and territories, created a brand new regime to handle a disability savings plan and to enable people to set one up anywhere in Canada. And now there's over $2 billion in it. That could not have been achieved without the innovation inside the system. So my point here is that we have to, with this pattern, setting the table with allies and adversaries and strangers, is that, to achieve the kind of broad impact and expand and spread the benefits, of our big ideas and our solutions and prevent them from being marginalized or orphans, we need everyone on board. And that means often working with people we don't like, people who've hurt us, or people who we've hurt. So that's the second pattern, Sylvia.
Great.
are we running out of time here for talking? And
You know what?
should we?
And then I was going to say, if you can maybe speak at a very high level to the other four, one of the things that certainly struck me is that they're interconnected for sure. But if you can just sort of give us a bit of a taste of them, then maybe what I would like to do is then move us in, because I know we are generating lots of questions, and I want to make sure we've got lots of time for those.
Yeah. So sorry about those
No
technical
worries.
glitches. So the second one, creating a container for your content. This is really about metaphor, about storytelling, about framing. And what we discovered is that you can have the best content in the world, but if you don't package it, if you don't create either a metaphorical container or a literal container for your content, it may not go very far. And so the best example of a literal container is the blue box. Thousands of papers written, books written about the importance of recycling, and then a group of people in Kitchener-Waterloo decided to paint a plastic box blue, and all of a sudden curbside recycling expands and explodes all over the world. Mobilizing your economic power is pattern 4, and here we're talking about recognizing the economic power of our memberships and our constituency, and using them to achieve our social purposes. And every constituency has economic power. I would just again defer to Fathers Jimmy Tompkins and Fathers Moses Cody in the Maritimes with the Cody Institute and the Antigonish movement as an example, of people blending their social and their economic power to achieve justice for Cape Bretoners and Nova Scotians and Maritimers after the Depression. But the Canadian Credit Union movement, the Case Movement Desjardins, the social economy in Quebec are all examples of this. The fifth pattern, the fifth pattern, advocate with empathy. What I'm suggesting is that when we look at our governments, we may say they're broken, they're not working as well as they should, or they're paralyzed. And while I would agree with you or them, people who have that diagnosis, I would also suggest that it is our job as advocates to understand some of the limitations of being in government today, whether elected or as a public servant. And so if we want government to be empathetic to our challenges, we have to be empathetic to theirs. And what we see emerging across Canada are a group of people who I call solution-based advocates, who not only propose a solution as opposed to just criticize, but also propose a solution in a way in which it enhances the future decision-making capacity of the system.
So can you make that a bit concrete? Just what that looks like?
Okay. A good question.
Sorry, I don't want to take you off on a tangent. So maybe, yeah, just a little bit. Like, what does that look like?
Well, a great example is the Social Finance Task Force, which was established by SIG. We had hoped that the government of Canada would join us in creating a social finance task force to look at how we could improve the ability of nonprofits and social enterprises to earn revenue and achieve their mission. But the government of Canada was not able to join us, and so SIG, under the leadership of Tim Drayman, launched the Social Finance Task Force. And developed the recommendations, which the government of Canada is still working on. But this was an example in which we didn't criticize the government for not joining us. We said, okay, you're not capable of doing it right now. And in fact, then Minister of Finance Jim Flaherty admitted that he and his public servants didn't have the capacity to investigate social finance. And when we gave him the final report, he said, thank you, because you've done what I and my staff have not been able to do, and can I have an extra 30 copies, because I want to give them to every Minister of Finance in the country and every Deputy Minister. So that's a small example of solution-based, but in a way that increases capacity of the system. Yeah, is that?
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, perfect. So tell us just briefly about number 6, and then we'll move us into questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
So here, I'm taking a page from Peter Block's work, and Peter says that how can be a killer question. A lot of great ideas can be drowned if you say, well, how are you going to implement that? You know, a lot at the beginning, you know, it's instinct, it's intuition, the creative leap. And so if people ask you how you're going to do it too soon, then I think you're going to prevent a lot of innovation, a lot of different ways of tackling old problems from happening. But equally, you know, the how is about technique and technology, and we should be careful not to get too fascinated or seduced, you know, by that. And what we saw in all of the innovators that we interviewed, in the book profiles, about 50, was an ethical chord that runs through them, and that started early in their lives. And as a friend of mine and a man I profile in the book, Michael Clegg, says, he says that you know, my strategies come and go, but my values have remained the same. And so what I'm really trying to do here is acknowledge, first of all, that who is more important than how we do it, who we are, but also secondly, that social change is a job for everyone. There is no elite group, and if we're relying on it, then we're going to be very, very disappointed. Even the most progressive, you know, social change agents out there will not be able to achieve what they're achieving without without all of us stepping forward into what I call a resurrection of the ordinary. So
beautiful, beautiful. So there's been lots of questions, Al, about, you know, you spoke about the 3 types of innovators, right? The disruptive innovator, who's like the passionate amateur, the bridging innovator, who and you cited the philanthropy sector as a great example, you know, supporting and lifting up those innovators and validating their work. And then you talked about the receptive innovators, which are the folks within the system who welcome in and help to anchor this a promising innovation within the system. Tinasha has a question, and I wonder if we can unmute her. Maybe you can start us off into our question phase by posing your question, which is related to this notion of the different kinds of innovators. Is that possible? Can we unmute her? Or would you like me to, how about I offer out, oh, there you go. Welcome. So you had a great question. You want to share it with us?
Sylvia, it's Christy here. Tanisha has asked that I ask the question on her behalf, and the question is, how can we facilitate more connections between disruptive innovators and bridging innovators?
Well, there's, I think, 2 things that have to, have to happen in my experience. I had a terrible job believing that I needed help from anyone else. I couldn't imagine why people didn't see the clarity of, of my ideas, my inventions, whatever they were, immediately. And so I was so stubborn. It's this kind of part of the chip on the shoulder attitude that I had, that I wasn't open to much advice. And so I guess I don't know if this is relevant to other people, but a lot of social entrepreneurs that I meet, they've got their head down. They have to just to kind of achieve some modicum of success and to make their idea come alive and wrestle their big idea to the ground. So this kind of facilitation involves 2 things. One, admitting that we could use a lot more help in our interaction with systems. And two, have you ever thought of reaching out to a foundation or to somebody in a foundation and to ask them for advice, not money? Now, I know a lot of people talk about that, but foundations have, they have a stockpile of, of dollars that they're awarding one way or the other, but they have a stockpile of expertise and experience at making change. And we very, very, very seldom tap into that. So most foundations that I know and people who work in them would be willing to sit down for a coffee or a lunch or a meeting to simply talk about, provide advice to you on how you might package your idea so it's more understood or accessible to people in the system. And I suppose maybe there's a third thing, and it is to seek out allies inside our systems, our institutions, our governments. As I said earlier, there are allies there who are treading water, and they're just waiting for us to appear, not criticizing, but ready to link up to see what we can do together. So I hope that helps.
Oh, fabulous. Are there other questions out there, Christy, that you're getting that are bubbling? Anyone, if you have not yet but have a burning question, I'd really encourage you to put it in the box. But while we're waiting, I had a bit of a question, which is, so what are your hopes, Al, around bringing these 6 patterns to life? Like, what's your deepest hope in writing this book and sharing it with us and other social innovators?
Well, I suppose I have pretty modest, hopes on one level. I recognize how busy people are, and how tough it is to do this work, that we're engaged in. And so I know people don't have lots of time, to step back and reflect. And so I simply wish that they reserve, 1, 2, 3% of their time to step back and with friends, allies, colleagues, reflect on the ideas in these patterns and the stories that illustrate the pattern. So that's my hope. I think we are capable of doing great things. And that means not just inventing new approaches or rescuing good ideas from one region of the country and spreading it elsewhere. I think we are capable of achieving deep impact, of transforming our structures and our institutions, of doing what Adelaide Hoodless has done, of doing what the first Canadian legislators did in that story I told you earlier. And so that's my hope with the book, that it'll ignite a conversation, and that when we do so, that we'll pay more attention to what it is about Canadian change making that might be useful, along with, of course, what will be useful and is useful from other parts of the world.
Beautiful. So there's a wonderful comment related to this, I think, that has been posted on Twitter, and that is connected to, a recognition that we need to create these opportunities for more mentoring between the different kinds of disruptors. The 3 kinds of disruptors that you identified. What are your thoughts about where you've seen that work really well, or how we could make that happen?
Well, what? I'll tell you where it's worked really well. It's with your colleague and the founder of Tamarack. So I profiled Paul Bourne, in the book. But just imagine this. So Paul is winning United Nations awards with the organization he founded in Kitchener-Waterloo to reduce poverty in Kitchener-Waterloo. And the United Nations comes to his city to give him an award, and he says, with all due respect, I think you should be firing me, not awarding me, because while we seem to have achieved some markers in our organization, the overall poverty rates in Kitchener-Waterloo have gone up. That's a paradox. And so Paul, he brought in some other people to run, the great work that CODA was doing, but he then set about this business of convening people in Canadian cities. Now imagine that. This was the pattern that was our biggest surprise, to set the table for allies, adversaries, and strangers. That's what Paul set out to do, to use conversation to make social change. I had always looked at that as a means to an end. But in fact, what Paul proves is that it's an end in itself, and that all kinds of sparks happen when you bring unlikely players together and you break down the barriers of mistrust, misunderstanding, lack of awareness, etc. And so, big summit coming up with Tamarack and vibrant communities in May, with over 100 cities across Canada now have poverty reduction tables. This is convening at its greatest. So we're capable of doing that in other spheres and in other areas, is to reach out. This is why I think to think and act like a movement is so important, is to kind of reach out beyond our comfort zone, make peace with people who've hurt us or that we've betrayed, and to begin to think about how we can work together.
Wow, Al, thank you so much. This has just been such a fabulous conversation. And, what's the real gift is that you have actually taken the time to sort of step back and dive deep and offer for all of us some patterns to help make better sense and bring more intentionality to this really important work around making positive change happen in our communities. I can't thank you enough. I'm really excited to sort of see and to hear where this goes next. I know if we can move to the next slide, I know, Al, you had said a couple of things. One, to remind folks that if you go to Al's website, www.aletmanski.com, you can download the introductory chapter to this book. And is this where people would register up if they want to buy a copy of the book too, Al?
You bet. Well, there, and I've got another website called impact6.ca. I think you might have it somewhere on one of the slides.
Yes. Okay, good.
And I think my Twitter handle is there too. And I know that these webinars are hard for those of you who are on the receiving end and I notice a lot of really interesting chat. So Sylvia, I really appreciate you grouping the questions, sending them to me, but I also, want to say to people, message me directly on Twitter, and I'll reply, or email me at Etmanski at plan.ca. That's probably the quickest one. I'd love to continue this conversation. My personal goal now is to wake up every morning and to think about how I can illuminate the great change making that is going on in our country. That's what is driving me right now, and so that means it's something I can't do on my own. So please connect with me.
Beautiful. Okay, absolutely. So there's a call out, folks. Al needs you to connect and give him your stories and your questions. If I could ask us to forward ahead, you'll see that our slide in front of us also reminds you that tamarackcommunity.ca is in many ways a platform to help convene all of us, and we share the knowledge that we encounter. So that's how you can find us. And in particular, we've been talking about bringing the different kinds of disruptors together. Oftentimes, there's no better way to do that than through learning, face-to-face learning events. And I just want to profile the 3 of Tamarack's most recent upcoming learning events. Our Champions for Change, which is really for backbone leaders of collective impact efforts in April in Calgary. The Poverty Summit, which Al referenced, which is happening in Ottawa in May, and our Neighbors event. We're thrilled to be welcoming Vicki Kamak, Al's partner, along with John McKnight and Jim Deers to join us in Hamilton. So would love to see many of the folks on today's call there as well. So thank you all very much. Hope you have a fabulous day, and thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Al. We so appreciate you sharing your wisdom today.
Pleasure, a pleasure. Thanks, Sylvia.
Okay, take care.